The Great War. A war to end all wars. That's what people called World War I, before they knew there was going to be a second one, because it was unimaginable that any war could be worse or bigger than the one they had just fought. Today, we're going to discuss some of the causes of the Great War. We'll talk about some of the main events of the war and look at effects of the war, including the spread of the Spanish flu, which didn't actually start in Spain. In the previous video, we talked about imperialism. The rich, industrialized countries of the world began to take control of the poor but resource-rich countries that did not have strong industrialized economies. England may have started, but soon Germany, Italy, and other large countries in Europe began to fight over who was going to take what. And what makes a country feel better than having a strong military? Each country began to build up its army and navy, which created a sense of patriotism and nationalism. Citizens were proud of their countries and were willing to go to war to defend them. Countries began to look around and create alliances and treaties, friends and agreements to protect each other if an enemy decided to attack. It all started when Austria annexed or took over Bosnia and Herzegovina, two countries that today most people can't even find on a map. But Serbia, a neighboring country, was a little angry because they had wanted to annex Bosnia. So, in response, a secret organization called the Black Hand decided to assassinate the heir to the Austrian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and his wife, Sophie. On June 28, 1914, the couple visited Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia. There were 6 assassins waiting along the route. Their motorcade drove by one assassin. He did nothing. The motorcade drove by another assassin. He did nothing. The motorcade drove by a third assassin. He threw a bomb, except it bounced off the car and hit one behind it. The assassin took a cyanide pill and jumped into the river. Unfortunately, the cyanide was so old, it only made him throw up, and the river was only about a foot deep. The motorcade sped away, so the other 3 assassins could not do anything. The Archduke and his wife made it safely to the town hall. On the way back, they decided to go to the hospital to visit the people who had been hurt from the bomb. Unfortunately, they made a wrong turn and stopped directly in front of one of the assassins. He killed the Archduke and his wife, and this one event set off a chain reaction that led to global war. Austria declared war on Serbia. But Serbia was friends with Russia. But Austria was friends with Germany. But Russia was friends with France. And France was friends with England. And Germany was friends with Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire. And Italy was friends with Germany, but they didn't like how they had started the whole thing, so they made friends with England. And Japan decided to join in too. The two sides became known as the Allies and the Central Powers. Many countries were neutral and did not fight. Spain, Switzerland, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden all stayed out of the fighting. Belgium was neutral too, until Germany invaded it to get to France. The war was fought on two main lines, called the Western Front, which ran along the borders of France and Italy, and the Eastern Front, which ran along the border of Russia and Austria-Hungary. The system of fighting that developed was called trench warfare, and it was miserable. Each side dug hundreds of miles of trenches. They would not make them straight to confuse and stop the enemy from shooting everyone in a line. At the top was barbed wire. There were some trenches in the back to store supplies and plan new attacks. There were snipers that would shoot anything that popped up over the edge of the trench. During an attack, soldiers would crawl over the top and across the distance between the two trenches, called no man's land. Cannons and grenades would pound the land, and the holes would fill with mud, dead bodies, and smoke. If the soldiers were lucky, they would make it through no man's land, past the enemy barbed wire, and into the trench to kill as many as they could find. They would take a trench, and then a few days or weeks later, the enemy would retake the trench, back and forth, for about 3 years, with little to show for it but dead soldiers. There were 4 main new technologies that people hoped would end the war faster. Instead, they just killed soldiers faster, but did nothing to end the war. Machine guns could fire between 400 and 600 bullets per minute. Tanks were clunky compared to today's armored vehicles. They broke down fast and were slow enough to run away from, but they were mounted with enough machine guns to make them deadly in the right areas. Poison gases like chlorine and mustard gas were used by both sides. The gas dropped to the bottom of the trenches and killed and burned many soldiers. Submarines with torpedoes were used by the German Navy to sink many ships. On the home front, places where the war was not being fought, like London and Paris, civilians had to live with rationing. They could only buy a small amount of some foods, like sugar and flour. Propaganda, fake news, was also developed to make people feel patriotic about the war. Because of imperialism, the war spread from Europe across Africa and Asia to truly become a world war. But wait, what about America? Well, the United States was happy to produce and sell weapons to the Allies. After all, this wasn't their fight, or at least it wasn't until Germany in 1917, with its new submarines called U-boats, destroyed a passenger ship called the Lusitania, with 128 Americans killed. The Americans were outraged, but President Wilson did not join the war until Germany secretly tried to get Mexico to fight the United States. It was good timing because by 1917, Russia was worn out. They had used all their resources and lost over 5.5 million soldiers. Tsar Nicholas was forced out, and a new government took over. The communist government of Vladimir Lenin made peace with Germany and left the war. Now, Germany only had one border to fight. Germany moved all its forces to the Western Front, but they were tired, and the Americans were not. It wasn't long before the German and Austrian people turned on their governments and demanded peace. On November 11th, the war finally ended. Today, we celebrate it as Veterans Day, or Armistice Day in Europe. President Woodrow Wilson of the United States took a lead in forming a new world peace. He focused on the idea of self-determination, that all people have the right to choose their own governments. He began the League of Nations, an international organization dedicated to keeping world peace. The Treaty of Versailles, yes, that Versailles, also punished Germany and made them completely responsible for the whole war. They had to pay the Allies for reparations, or I'm so sorry money. The Allies also chopped up the Central Powers, creating new countries and taking land from Germany, Austria, the Ottoman Empire, and Russia. Even though it lost the most soldiers during the war, Russia, now called the Soviet Union, was not included in the treaty because they left early. Japan and Italy were also mad because they joined the war to get more territory, but actually lost land. Many other countries were upset because even though President Wilson talked about self-determination, they were still governed by the same imperialist systems as before the war. White European countries still controlled the Asian and African governments and territories. They had peace, but too many countries were unhappy for it to last long. The Great War had many consequences, but perhaps the greatest social impact was on women's suffrage. When men were drafted to become soldiers, jobs that were only for men suddenly became open for women. Before, women were seen as weak and only supposed to stay in the home, and now they volunteered for the Red Cross and took jobs in factories and stores. Men could no longer prove that women were too weak and dumb to vote. Skirts got shorter, and gasp, some women even began to wear pants. And in today's time, we need to talk about another consequence of World War I, the Spanish flu pandemic, also called the 1918 flu epidemic. First of all, it didn't start in Spain. It started in Kansas, right here in the United States, at a soldier training camp. It was called the Spanish flu because Spain, a neutral country, did not have a gag order on the press. The Spanish newspapers could print stories about the sickness that others could not. The virus traveled with the soldiers to Europe and back again. It spread in crowded troop trains and prisoner of war camps. The biggest difference between COVID-19 and the Spanish flu was that the Spanish flu killed young, healthy people. There were also no advanced medical devices like drug therapies or ventilators to help the sick. Vaccines weren't even invented yet. The estimate is between 20 and 50 million people died from the flu, more than the total number of soldiers that died in the war. It was even worse after the war when the soldiers went home, spreading it all over the world. The virus mutated, and the second wave was worse than the first. In Philadelphia, they refused to admit there was a problem and had a big parade. In just 10 days, over 200,000 people were sick and 1,000 were dead. By the end, over 15,000 Philadelphians had died. Overall, the Great War brought the world into the modern era. It refined weapons of destruction such as guns, tanks, and airplanes. It resulted in social and political shifts away from monarchies and toward republics. The peace at the end of the war drew new national borders and set the stage for an even worse war to come. But that is a topic for our next video. As always, I hope you like this video. Please like and subscribe. Until next time, stay safe and stay creative.